This week, Koom interviews Bob Budiansky. He was a civil engineering major who ended up writing, editing, and drawing for Marvel. How did that happen? And how did that civil engineering background help him when he went on to work on Transformers comics? He also talks about which aspects of people he knew were applied to Transformers characters, the origins of Circuit Breaker, and his feelings looking back on his years at Marvel. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
It's Koom for Deconstructing Comics. I'm talking to Bob Budiansky in New York.
Yes, hello.
Hi. So
I'm actually in New Jersey, just to be precise, but close enough.
Okay, cool. Did you grow up in the New York area?
Yeah, I grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah, and you went to school in New York for college as well.
Yeah, I went to school in the University of Buffalo.
Did you study English, something like that?
I was a civil engineering major.
So that's a really interesting turn from civil engineering to writing. How did that happen?
Well, good question. I always wanted to work in comic books, since I was a kid. But then as I got older, I kind of thought it was unrealistic. So I always had a head for science, so I became a civil engineering major in college. All the time I was in college, though, I was an artist with a student newspaper because I wanted to be a comic book artist. And I had an interest in art, and I had some talent, not a lot, but some. And eventually, during my graduate year, I had already gotten a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. Eventually, I was connected to a friend of mine who had graduated, who also worked in the student newspaper, who had gotten a low-level editorial job at Marvel, and he said, "I'm leaving my job. Would you like to interview for it?" So he arranged for me to interview for his editorial assistant job for the Marvel British department, and I was able to get the job. So I dropped out of grad school and started working at Marvel Comics. So I wasn't a writer initially. I really was just an editorial assistant hoping to be an artist. But over the years, because I stayed with Marvel for a number of years, over the years I acquired skills. I just absorbed what was around me. I got to know the nuts and bolts of what it took to write comic books. And eventually I had some opportunities to write things, and I did what I could with the opportunities and became a regular writer.
Right. So originally when you had that dream of working comics, you were thinking of yourself as an artist.
Yeah, and before I was a writer for Marvel, I was an artist for Marvel.
Right.
So I wore a lot of different hats over the years, but for a while I was the regular artist on Ghost Rider. That was before I was a regular writer of anything. So although there were many issues of Ghost Rider that I worked with the writer at that time, J.M. DeMatteis, he and I co-plotted the stories together. So I wasn't writing the scripts, but I was helping to develop the plots.
Were you influenced or inspired by certain artists when you were young, when you wanted to get into comics?
Oh, yeah. I had a whole bunch of favorites when I was a kid. Yeah, well, I was a fan of Gil Kane, Carmine Infantino, Mike Sikowski, later on Jack Kirby, John Romita Sr. Those were all people who I really admired their artwork and would go and look for their books when they came out on the newsstands. Yeah, definitely.
And did you have a sense of what it was to produce a comic, the comic craft, or did you just kind of think of yourself as drawing the stuff and not really thinking about the process that would lead to a published comic?
Well, I think as I got older, I became more and more aware of comic books have a lot of different people putting their creative input into it to make it work. So I kind of got a sense of the process. I can't tell you exactly when it all clicked in my head, I think when you're a little kid, when you're really young, and you see a comic book, you buy it, I think I probably was like a lot of people who were 7 or 8 years old looking at their first comic books thinking it just happens.
Yeah.
I've spoken to a lot of audiences over the years, including a lot of children, and they're amazed that a human being is behind some of this stuff when they meet me. And I say, well, here's what I've done, and show them examples. And it's like a surprise that there's actually people who put their effort into making this happen. But as you get older and you get more wise to the ways of the world, it becomes more and more obvious that it's a process, and it's kind of like an assembly line process where different people along the way come in and write it and illustrate it and color it and letter it, et cetera, et cetera. So, I kind of picked up on that by the time I was working at Marvel.
Sure. Do you think there's any kind of link between civil engineering and drawing or assembling comics, in that civil engineering, at least in the old days, used to involve a lot of draftsmanship and a lot of, thinking about how things fit together?
I never really connected the two like that.
Yeah.
They were pretty different skills. Now, it's true that I did take what was called mechanical drawing back in junior high school. So, I worked with rulers and T-squares and triangles.
I did too when I took drafting, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think any of that, I mean, it wasn't a tremendous help in drawing comic book characters where you're trying to make the characters as animated as possible. It's almost like the polar opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, usually these two things are sort of very divided. I mean, my parents wanted me to be a doctor, or at the very least an engineer. And so I think it's kind of interesting that you had this dream and you ended up kind of landing there, even though you made the effort to do this very practical career. Did you pick engineering as something just because you had an aptitude for it and it was practical, or because it was also a passion of sorts that somehow?
Well, it was something I was interested in. It was it is practical, obviously, but putting structures up is about as practical as you can get.
Yeah.
You can't just whimsically put them up. You really have to know what you're doing. It was an area of interest, but again, as I got older through my school years, my elementary through high school years, it became more obvious to me that becoming a comic book artist was perhaps a little bit of a pipe dream, and I should look into some other options. But in any case, I know a lot of people who began going to college for one thing and wound up in something totally different. So I was just one of those people.
And you were never one of those kids who went from the Bronx into Manhattan and went to Marvel Studios and dropped in, because apparently in the old days, fans would do that, and they'd be quite hospitable.
Yes, I know a couple of who started that way. No, I was in college. I graduated. I was going for one more year, it was a 2-year program for my master's. And like I said, this friend of mine who had gone to my same college with me and graduated the same year as me, he landed there at Marvel. I visited him a couple of times during the holidays. So I was still at college, but I was home. I was home in the Bronx, where I grew up, and I was able to visit him in Manhattan at his office, at the Marvel offices, and he introduced me to people.
Sure.
And so, I liked the idea of working there. And then he called me a few months later and said, "Hey, I'm leaving my job. You want to interview for it?" So one thing led to the other. A little side note, which is when he brought me down there, he said, because he knew I was an artist or wanted to be an artist from the student newspaper days, he said, bring some samples and I'll show them around. So I came down there. He introduced me to the art director, who at the time was Marie Severin.
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at my samples and very gently said, you should find yourself another career.
Well,
so turned out like 6 months later, I was working there. Marie Severin was the art director who oversaw the British department, which is where I was working. That was the department I was hired to work in. I'm sure she completely forgot that I was this wannabe artist that stopped by her office briefly 6 months earlier. I'm sure she had a steady stream of people like me coming through. And so I was working with her, on a regular basis, and she could not have been more generous with her time or a better teacher. She was terrific. Once I was on staff and she understood I wanted to be a Marvel artist, she was great.
Wow,
great to work
what
with.
a great story. Yeah, no, I just meant like sort of as a teenager, because I think for a lot of us that didn't live anywhere close to New York, the fantasy was if we could take the subway in and maybe go to some of those conventions, those early conventions, or maybe even go to the offices or whatever, we would have been doing that. But the reality is maybe many of us wouldn't. We would have just been living our lives.
It didn't happen that way for me, although I did know somebody, which is always a help in any industry.
Sure.
But I didn't go to. I had never been to a comic book convention. I know they existed at the time, but I was never one of those people who frequented them. And I didn't just pop into the office randomly. But my successor, I only stayed on staff for about a year. My successor to that particular job was a guy named Danny Fingeroth, and Danny and I went to high school together. Now, we weren't great friends, but we knew each other. We were in a couple of same classes together. And he's one of those people who's exactly what you just described.
Right.
He showed up at the office one day. He didn't know anybody. At that time, you were able to walk into like the receptionist would say, "Oh yeah, I'll get somebody to show you around."
Sure.
And he was a complete stranger as far as I know, and he got shown around, and I bumped into him in the hallway, and I said, "Hey, I remember you. We went to high school together, and we remembered each other."
Year?
And same year, we graduated the same year, and so I told him, "Well, if I hear of any jobs, give me your phone number. If I hear of any jobs, I'll let you know." And it turned out to be my job. A few months later, I quit my job to be a freelance artist, and I called him up. I said, "You want to interview for my job?" That's how he got the job. But he was one of those guys who just popped up in the office one day and decided he wanted to look around and maybe, find a job at Marvel. So
yeah, only in the old days.
Yeah. Nowadays with building security, you would never get past the lobby.
Yeah. Well, also Marvel is a very different kind of operation and entity now. But anyway, leaving that aside, quick couple of questions. You said you were editing the British line, or you were
I was editorial assistant, which means I was helping the editor. The editor at that time was Larry Lieber, Stan's brother.
Sure.
So he was my first boss.
And then I was wondering, do you think there's any connection between civil engineering and the mechanical aspect of the Transformers?
Well, that's probably okay. So you finally touched on a connection that actually exists. So I was working on the Transformers for almost since its beginning at Marvel and just in general, before even the toys were out there in the public to be bought. And one of the things I started doing for Hasbro through Marvel was I was naming almost all the toys that they were coming out with, and I was coming up with character profiles for all these toys. And they really liked my work. They were very complimentary. They rarely had any problems with anything I turned in. They were really thrilled with what I was doing. And I would go up to the Hasbro offices in Rhode Island on a semi-regular basis to check out the new lines of toys that they were coming up with or whatever. They would call me up for different meetings. And one day I was up there at the offices, and one of the executives said to me, "Were you ever in the military?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, the reason I ask is because in your character descriptions, you have all this technical jargon that you use, and it sounds like you were in the military." I said, "No, I was a civil engineering major. So finally, something I learned in civil engineering has come in handy." So that's how it worked. That's how it worked to my advantage, to have that sort of science engineering mind while writing Transformers material.
Well, before I knew that you were a civil engineer, you sent me a couple of scans of first pages for scripts that you wrote. And one of them was for, let me take a look here, Transformers number 16. And I thought your description of the environment on Cybertron with all of the junk and, the mechanical debris and all of that was really evocative. But also I can see how knowing your way around some of this technical stuff would certainly help. But, that wasn't the reason, I'm sure, that you were put on the project. No,
they had no idea I was a civil engineer.
Yeah.
They had no idea that I had a civil engineering background. It didn't matter whatsoever. If I wrote anything that's evocative, that was my attempt to be a good writer and give as much information to the artist. Because what you're describing is not the script, you're describing the plot. So the plot is what the artist based his illustrations on
Right.
it. So I was just trying to communicate as well as I could what I was going for. Now, the fact that I have perhaps more of a scientific background than some other writers, so maybe that came into play in some of my descriptions. But any writer will tell you that you write from experience. So if I have some experience from my engineering background that I could put into my scripts or my plots, and all the better. On the other hand, I couldn't write about my experiences as an astronaut because I was never an astronaut. So it all depends on what your backgrounds are and what you could bring to your stories.
Sure. I mean, a fair amount of interest and imagination also helps. I mean, if you were particularly interested in space and whatever. So going back to Transformers, I know this is what you get asked about a lot, but do you mind mining some of this stuff?
I'll do what I can, but you're mining a very old mine, so.
Yeah, and a very old theme. Okay. So, when you came on board with Transformers, did you just see it kind of as a gig, or was there something in the concept, in the world that existed in terms of the Hasbro toys at the time that sparked your imagination?
Well, okay, there's a two-part answer to that question. So first of all, I saw it as an opportunity. I was not a writer. I'd co-written some plots and, some other odds and end material for Marvel over the years, but I'd never written any scripts. And so when this came to me from the editor-in-chief at that time, which was Jim Shooter, so I saw this as an opportunity for me to prove that I could be a writer who can be used by Marvel to write stories. Initially, I wasn't hired as the writer of the comic book. I was hired as the writer of these character profiles and names. The writing came a little bit later for the comic book stories. Anyway, as far as did it spark my imagination? It must have, because I came up with over 250 characters and profiles and about 50 stories. So, it certainly sparked my imagination.
Well, you created a world, which is a lot for, I don't know if you were really a first-time writer, but let's say a fairly new writer, because you didn't have the advantage of coming in on a title or a concept or whatever that had been fleshed out so you could continue the legacy of something. And I was trying to think about, I told you that the Transformers was kind of something that's fairly nostalgic for me that I loved as a kid. I've tried watching, and that's more the show than the comics, although I read some of the comics. I've tried watching the show as an adult, and it doesn't do the same thing for me, which is probably pretty predictable. But I was trying to figure out what it is about the Transformers that sparked something in me as a kid, and I think it's the idea that you can transmute into something else, the magic of shape-shifting into something else. But it wasn't something that was a supernatural tale. It was something that was very grounded in the nuts and the bolts of things that you saw around you, and I thought that was really fascinating and unique. I don't know if that was a common thing for Japanese culture and toys, but for us over in the West, it was a very different thing.
Well, I think I'm no expert on Japanese culture or toys, but this was I think you're kind of saying, this is very grounded in something that you could grasp, which is a robot, like a mechanical thing that has life to it, that could turn into cars, planes, weapons, whatever they turned into. These are all things that are very understandable to the mind of, an 8-year-old boy or whoever the target audience was at that time. So I think it did lend itself to being embraced by its audience because it was so relatable. Yet it was so different because these weren't your typical superheroes and spandex costumes. It was something that was, for that time, unique. And I guess the transformability of the toys, which entered into the characters as well, obviously, plus the characterizations that we developed and the backstories, all that worked together to create like a very intriguing universe for those people who were exposed to it at that time, you know.
Yeah. I mean, as an adult, though, developing this stuff, did you ever kind of have any kind of mind blocks? Did you ever say, for example, why would these alien robots transform into what are like, you know, very recognizable American?
Well, you know, that's an excellent question, and I don't have a good answer for it. I will cop a plea in the sense that I did not write the backstory. That was written by Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief at Marvel. So he came up with the whole concept of the Autobots and Decepticons traveling to Earth and continuing their battle on Earth. And it so happens that all these incredibly powerful alien mechanical life forms happen to turn into recognizable Earth forms of cars and trucks and planes. Why? I guess it's sort of defined in the motto of the Transformers, robots in disguise, so they have the ability to disguise themselves and blend in. So I guess that was always there, that as part of their operating successfully on our planet, they should look as if they blended in. You know, I think to varying degrees, the stories carry that forward. On the other hand, if they're on another planet, if they're on Cybertron or something, why should they look like a Chevy Camaro or something?
Yeah, I didn't get the sense in the cartoons that they could kind of camouflage themselves. I think in the later movies they tried to kind of weakly patch over that and say exactly what you said.
Well, I know in the Bumblebee movie they showed specifically scanning different robotic vehicles, not robotic, but Earth vehicles and copying their forms, and had that ability. I don't know. We didn't deal with it a lot in the comic books. I can't comment on the animated TV series since I never watched it.
Oh, you didn't, eh? Oh.
No, so don't ask me any questions about that because I have no idea.
No problem. I just want to be honest about the fact, where I was kind of coming from with the nostalgia.
Yeah, okay.
But more, I'm just interested in the kind of the creative thing. I mean, another thing that I even wondered, like as a kid, was the sort of the size and possibility of things. Like, for example, you had Megatron and Optimus Prime fight each other, and they were sort of about the same size. But, Megatron would transform into a gun, and not just a gun, but like a handgun, and then you had Optimus Prime who was a truck. So what did you do with this, like, concept of space? Like, as an engineer, you must...
I didn't deal with it, frankly. I mean, that was a given. Again, like I was given the backstory. I was given the fact that this guy turned into a gun. I probably could have written a story about why Megatron can somehow reduce his mass and size into a gun that you could hold in your hand. I just never got around to dealing with it. Maybe if I stayed on the book longer, I would have come up with some explanation. I
was just wondering if you wrestled with things like this, or was it more like, okay, here's the concept, and I'm just going to try to do my job to the best of my ability?
Yeah, I think that's more like that. I mean, I was just trying to come up with entertaining stories that were, that moved it along from month to month. Plus, I was, among all the other things I was trying to do, which is tell an exciting, fun story, give the characters personalities that were interesting and engaging, and doing all the usual things that you do in a story. Every 6 months, Hasbro would come out with another 20 or 30 characters that I had to figure out a way to introduce into the storyline. So, to quote an old cliche, I had bigger fish to fry than to figure out why Megatron can turn into a handgun. There's only so much room in a 20-page comic book to fit all the stuff. I mean, I had to fit a lot of stuff in there. So I didn't want to get too bogged down in the weeds of, why he could transform from this size to that size. As it was, I had to come up with different rationales of why we keep introducing dozens of new characters in what is essentially a closed environment. Because originally they showed up on the same spaceship, which has a finite dimension to it. They show up on the same spaceship on Earth. And then we keep introducing more characters who show up on Earth. So I had to come up with ways to do that and integrate it into a story that made some sense and that acted as a story and not just an explanation.
Did you have any idea you'd be working on it for I think 6 years that you were going to work on it, or that it was going to become such a lasting big thing?
Well, okay, so I worked on it from 83. I started writing it sometime, I think, in 84, and I left it in early 89. I had been trying to get off the book for probably a year before I got off of it, because I was kind of running out of ideas, and I wanted to use my time to develop other ideas that I had while working full time on staff as an editor. So I didn't know I was going to work that long on the book. As it was, we planned the Transformers as a 4-issue miniseries, because at that time Marvel had no faith that any licensed property would automatically become a sales success. So they made a deal with Hasbro to put it out as a 4-issue miniseries. Sales were great, so it continued as a regular series after that. So I didn't know what it was going to turn into, or how long I would stay on it. But I was trying to get off of it because at the end, I was, like I said, I wanted to move on to other things, and I was kind of running out of ideas. At the time I left the Transformers, the actual toy line was dying. The sales were, down. The toy had been out 5 or 6 years by 84 through 89. It had been out about 5 years by then, and the sales were down, and the comic book sales were down as well. They probably had stopped producing new animation by that point, I think. So you just figured, well, this is something I did, and moving on. And I didn't look at it as something that would come back to life a decade or two later and become a billion-dollar movie franchise. It was kind of hard to imagine that. So.
Sure. I mean, one way I was thinking about it, and this may be a false comparison, was like when you look at somebody like Chris Claremont, who really grew that X line of books, and he was like writing everything almost pretty much for like a long time, and he was developing all of these characters and stuff. What you were doing was sort of comparable, because it was a big franchise, and you had all these characters, and you were making this world grow, and it had, a real commercial backbone, but you probably weren't thinking of it in a comparable way.
Well, I mean, I don't know how consciously I was thinking of it in a comparable way, but the thing is about Chris Claremont and the X-Men preceded Chris. When Chris got aboard,
that's true.
Somebody else had already developed these new characters to some extent.
Yeah.
Then he took them, he took them light years ahead of that and made them even a bigger success. So, and then when he got off the book in the early 90s, they were still successful. So X-Men had a vibrancy that existed outside of anything else, whereas Transformers was always connected to the toy. When the toy sales went down, so did the book. And I remember being in a meeting with Hasbro at some point early on. And again, I'm not from the toy industry, so I don't know any of this stuff, but one of them said, if a toy lasts 2 years, that is 2 Christmas seasons, because that's when the most toys get sold, right before the holidays. Mm-hmm. If it lasts 2 years in the toy industry, that's considered a success. So I looked at Transformers as just following the natural course of things. Toys rise and then they fall. Some of them don't even rise. Transformers was having a huge success over a number of years, and then it started falling. So it just made perfect sense to me that, okay, this is reaching the end of the line for this particular franchise, and Hasbro will find something else to put out, and I'll find something else to do too. So it's time to move on. So I didn't. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I certainly didn't put it in the same category as the X-Men. The X-Men had a vibrancy to it that was surging for a few decades before the movies started coming out, which made them even bigger. At least bigger to the public, maybe not bigger in sales and comics.
Coming up, characters in Transformers with traits of people Budiansky knows, the origins of Circuit Breaker, his feelings looking back on his years at Marvel, and more. I'm continuing to republish 2007 episodes of Deconstructing Comics in reverse order, unlocked by our patrons' generous support. This week's classic episode from June 11th, 2007, features Patrick Gannon talking about his cut paper art. The classic episodes can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by clicking on the earliest months listed on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com, or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarter Bin Podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarter Bin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarter Bin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarter Bin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
A friend of mine is a really big Transformers fan, so he gave me a question that he wants me to ask you. And the question is, did you name any of the Transformer characters on something that was connected to a friend or a family or something personal?
Yeah.
Would you want to share any of those, or?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I'm holding the book right now. I happen to have it out. So in issue 48, The Flames of Boltax. So my friend Janet Boltax had a natural name for a Transformers-related character. I went to college with her. I just had dinner with her a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to her and her friends there. She introduced me to a couple of friends, and I brought the comic book with me because she had talked to her friends that she'd been put into this comic book by me, so I wanted to show them the actual comic, which is why I have it sitting around my desk right now. So that particular storyline, Boltax, was not a Transformers. That was an actual toy by Hasbro, but it was a character that I introduced into the Transformers mythos as somebody who represented this vast storehouse of data that was coveted by both the Autobots and the Decepticons. So that was Boltax. But anyway, I introduced human characters that were based on family members. I don't remember if I named any Transformers other than Boltax, specifically after anybody I knew. You know, just most people's names don't lend themselves to mechanical creatures.
Sure.
But except for my friend Janet Boltax. So anyway, I would put people in there all the time that were based on people I knew.
A character I found really interesting is Circuit Breaker. I think that's her name, right?
Circuit Breaker, yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about her, because she sticks in my mind, and unfortunately, my mind's not the best for the comics, like I mentioned to you before, but she really stuck in my mind. I mean, for a few reasons. One is, I think, being fairly young and then seeing a woman with skin sort of exposed but not exposed, and then the fusion of the circuitry plus the humanity. I mean, that's been repeated in a few things now, including Terminator. There's a new Terminator movie that's coming out today, but also there's something deadly about her, and so I think in some ways I could kind of group her with certain characters like Elektra, or certain, women characters that were kind of striking because of their dangerous potential, and will.
Okay.
As a kid. So I'm curious if you could talk about her and where she came from, and she kept on coming back from what I vaguely remember.
Well, I wanted to create a human character that could stand up against the Transformers. Because up until then, I think she was introduced around issue 9, perhaps. The Transformers were basically just fighting each other, and so I wanted to create a human antagonist that, as so many humans in those stories I wrote back then, did not understand the Transformers, did not distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys. They all look like a threat to certain people, and B, not only took them as a threat, but was able to do something about it. So I came up with Circuit Breaker. That was the origin. I wanted to come up with a human antagonist to the Transformers.
Was there something about her that was particularly inspirational, as opposed to other human villains? Or, mean, what about, like, just even her design and her conception?
Well,
like,
I came up with the name Circuit Breaker, and I thought it was a cool name because not only did it have meaning, people understand Circuit Breaker is a thing. It's a thing, but it has the word circuit in it. So it suggested to me that whoever this character is should have circuitry involved in who this character is. So I came up with the origin. Again, it's a long time ago, like 35 years ago probably, when I came up with the character. But basically, I was inspired to come up with a character that expressed itself through circuitry, and I liked the idea of embedding the circuitry in the character, so they were like almost one. There was the circuit, the electrical circuit aspect of it, as well as the human aspect of it. I kind of remember thinking of Circuit Breaker as sort of another version of Iron Man, except whereas Iron Man's wearing a suit that's integrated with his body, Circuit Breaker was even more integrated. The suit was its body. The suit was, imprinted on its body. So Circuit Breaker was sort of a variation of that idea to some extent.
Well, I also was wondering, like, sometimes I come up with these odd ideas, but I was also wondering if it was some sort of manifestation of an unconscious fear. If you look at the end of Superman 3, the one with Richard Pryor in it,
which I've never watched.
Oh, you never watched? Okay.
So Superman's 1 and 2.
Well, anyway, number 3 sort of focuses on computers and Richard Pryor. Yeah. So, anyway, at the end, there's a character that becomes fused with computer circuitry. She's like a bad character, and then she's sort of deadly as a result. And I sort of saw Circuit Breaker in a kind of a similar way, like this like part of the reason I found her dangerous was because there was something lethal about circuitry coming to life and being fused with humans, and that was certainly the inspiration there to make this character. I mean, anybody who's just flesh and blood just walking around is probably not as lethal to the Transformers anyway. Sure.
As somebody who has this circuitry giving them all these amazing powers. So that was the whole point of it. She's Circuit Breaker. She's fused with this circuitry. She has a beef against the Transformers for what they did to her. She had some kind of accident that crippled her,
right?
And so she came up with this way to A, heal herself, and B, power herself so that she can go up against them. So she was supposed to be lethal. That was the point. That's why she was the character she was.
But you don't see some kind of ironic connection between that and the way we are now, where we've got people have their smartphones kind of glued to their hands, and
I haven't given it a lot of thought.
Yeah,
I wrote the character years ago. I haven't, whatever it was relevant to what was happening back in the 1980s, not what's happening to today. People are more today. I mean, if you want to step away from the Transformers for a moment and just say, well, people are more integrated, so to speak, with their devices than ever before. You can easily say that, but certainly when I was creating Circuit Breaker, that all these devices that we take for granted nowadays did not exist. On the other hand, computers were coming in, personal computers were coming into the fore, and the whole idea of robotic life forms and circuitry and electronics and all that was current back in the 1980s. I wasn't inventing anything that wasn't already out there. I was just kind of riding the wave of things that were going on.
Yeah, and so if you point to, like, I don't know, just randomly Superman 3, Circuit Breaker, and Terminator, you do have this idea kind of coming up again and again. I won't press it too much, but
in fact, I did watch the Terminator movies, and I certainly was inspired in different ways by the Terminator movies. In fact, I believe, if I recollect, my approach to introducing Cybertron as this devastated world, I think, was partially inspired by the scenes of the future Earth in the first Terminator movie.
Yeah.
And certainly the Terminators themselves were robotic life forms, except they had flesh. Actually, in the Terminator movie, when they do show the future, they're not flesh; they're robotics. They're all robotic, and they're because they don't have to hide themselves as humans.
That's right.
As I recall. So I'm sure
some of them do, so that
Transformers and Terminator, they all operate in the same arena of sci-fi.
Sure. Okay, I think we should get off that topic, and I do want to ask you about your tenure at Marvel. So you started off wanting to be an artist, coming in as an editorial assistant, and having various writing gigs and some art and a fairly solid editorial career. How do you feel about your tenure at Marvel?
Oh, well, I had a great time working at Marvel. I had so many opportunities to try new things, and whether it was as a writer, as an artist, as an editor. I worked with a lot of wonderful people. I was able to learn a lot from all these people that had so many talents of their own. So I would say when I look back at my time at Marvel, overall, I look back very satisfied with my time there. I was happy to be there, and it was a wonderful place to work most of the time. Not 100%, but most of the time.
Sure. I mean, there were some really exciting years, I think, in the 80s. That's the period of Marvel I liked the most. And for me, like I kind of gave up in the early 90s because to me things changed quite a bit when the Image guys really changed, I think, the focus of the drawing and the kinds of stories that were being told and stuff. And that seems to be around the time that you kind of left Marvel as well. Was there any kind of correlation with that? With Marvel changing, or? Well,
Marvel was going through death throes in the mid-90s.
Sure.
You might be aware, and they went bankrupt, I think, in late 96 or early 97 or something. So I left in January of 96. I was a second wave of massive layoffs. There was a massive layoff in January 95, and in January 96 there was another massive layoff. So hundreds of people lost their jobs, and I was one of those people. At that time, I was editor-in-chief of the Spider-Man line, so I'd kind of reached just about the pinnacle of editorial, but they were cutting back. There was all sorts of pressures on Marvel, which we can get into if you want to, but there were all sorts of pressures that forced Marvel to cut way back and then eventually go bankrupt.
Well, which years were you editor of the Spider-Man line, roughly?
I believe I became the editor-in-chief. What happened was in 94, in the fall of 94, the Marvel president decided to decentralize Marvel editorial. So whereas it used to be, up until then, there was a single editor-in-chief, as is traditional in publishing companies. So that was Tom DeFalco at the time. So his job was kind of wiped away and replaced with 5 editorial editor-in-chiefdoms. So I was one of them. I had no connection to Spider-Man, but I was selected to be the Spider-Man editor-in-chief. So there was Spider-Man editor-in-chief, and there was the X-Men editor-in-chief, and there was the Avengers editor-in-chief, which was all the Avengers-related books.
When you say elected, do you mean somebody just
selected? I was selected, not elected. Selected.
Selected. Okay.
Yeah.
You didn't. There wasn't like a new job that was created, and then different people applied. You were just kind of given a call.
No. I was just appointed. I mean, I wasn't like I was a stranger. I mean, I was working there, and I had a lot of success there up until that point. And and I don't know I frankly don't know how the decision was made that I should become the Spider-Man editor-in-chief, but 5 of us were selected. 5 of us senior editors were selected to be 5 editors-in-chief, and I was one of them. And
did you say this was in which year?
This was in 94, I think in the fall of 94, and this lasted for maybe a year or a little bit longer. This split up of the editorial lines into 5 chiefdoms. And then around the fall of 95, there was a new president of the company who didn't like that system. And he called us all in and he said, okay, we're eliminating that system and you're all going to report to Bob Harris, who was the editor-in-chief of the X-Men line. And now Bob Harris is the editor-in-chief of everything and you're all reporting to him.
Right. But just to go back before that happened in 94, were you mostly working on Sleepwalker or were you doing a bunch of different things?
Well, Sleepwalker was my freelance work. So I think by 94, Sleepwalker had ended anyway. But, when I talk about writing the Transformers or writing Sleepwalker, I'm doing that at home on weekends and at nights, and not during my day job. My day job was as an editor. So when what I was doing in 94 was I I was an executive editor, and I worked with the X-Men editorial team. I worked on Marvel trading cards. I worked on different special projects. I worked on the Marvel retail poster program. I had a whole bunch of different things I worked on.
So you were doing all of these things after leaving Transformers, or was there something else in there that was like really prime that I'm kind of missing here?
Okay, so again, let me just correct your implication there, which is leaving Transformers is leaving my freelance job as a writer.
Right.
I still had a 9-to-5 editorial job, which was independent of all my writing and a lot of my art. If I was doing any artwork during that period, I'd been a full editor for 13 years, starting around 1983. So Marvel hired me back on staff as a full editor. I'd been freelancing for a while, and so over those years, my job developed in all different ways. And a year or two into that job, Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief at the time, decided to create a new job called Special Projects Editor because Marvel was making all these connections to movie studios and toy companies and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to centralize it with one editor to manage all these projects that were coming in through all these partnerships. And given my experience in the Transformers, actually, because I had a pretty successful experience right from the get-go, he decided to make me the special projects editor. So after that, I was no longer editing regular mainstream Marvel books like monthly titles. I had been editing books like the Fantastic Four and Daredevil. So I was no longer a regular monthly title editor, but I was an editor of movie adaptations, toy books. We eventually did a book with the National Football League called NFL Super Pro, and so on and so forth. And just tons of different little
Did you miss the regular titles
things.
at all? I mean, did you miss the regular titles at all? Did you have an attachment to any of them that you kind of?
No, I didn't miss them at all. I found it very exciting to be able to work with different partners and come up with new ideas. I respected the old guard mainstream books, but and a lot of people who worked in those books were tremendous talents to work with, and I got to work with them anyway in other capacities in many cases. But basically, I liked the freedom of not being encumbered by 20 years or so of continuity that I had to keep track of or anything like that. So it was good to get involved in brand new things and see how they flew, if they made it or not. And then in the early 90s, Marvel decided to put out its own sets of trading cards with trading card companies as partners, and I was made the editor or the creative director of those projects, and those cards were tremendously successful, and they were a lot of fun to work on. I got to work with all these different artists, and
I used to have
a great time.
I only kind of fished them out recently, and I got rid of them recently. But anyway, let's just go back to the regular titles, because that's kind of the stuff that I think for a lot of fans, it's really like the heart and soul of Marvel. So a couple of questions I have. One is, in your capacity as editor, is that kind of hard because you're sort of playing a managerial role, whereas, you have like creative people who are kind of a little bit like cats maybe, doing their own thing and wanting to do their own thing. Is there some tension there and trying to like kind of wrestle them in and like stick to continuity, like you said, or stick to company policy or what have you?
Well, everybody's different. So you can't generalize. You can't say, it's hard to work with these people. I mean, everybody's different. Some people were a breeze to work with, and some people were difficult to work with. Some people had very strong points of view. Some people were more collaborative and were willing to, talk back and forth with me as an editor. It really varied. So I think as an editor, you want to hire people, or I wanted to hire people who were talented and who would carry the ball without me telling them what to do. On the other hand, there were times when I had to tell them what to do because either they didn't know what to do or they were going in directions that I thought were the wrong directions. But that's just part of the job. So, yes, some days were harder than others, but mostly it was a lot of fun. I mean, the best times I had as an editor was having a writer come into the office and we'd sit down and we'd discuss like the next 6 months worth of plots, and that could be great, because it was just like letting the ideas fly, going back and forth. We'd sit around, we'd go out to lunch for 3 hours or something, and we would just talk and come up with all these fun things to do.
It's very different dealing with writers than it is dealing with artists.
Yeah, of course. I mean, your writers are coming up with the initial ideas of what the artists are going to draw. I mean, the artists, as an editor, you try to give the artist every advantage. So especially, since I was working with like a lot of toy books, a lot of movie adaptations, I had to supply artists constantly with material for reference, whether it's what the toys look like or what the movie actors look like or whatever. So you just try to give the artists as much material that they can work with to make their jobs a little easier. But again, different artists and different writers have different personalities, so you can't generalize. Some artists and writers are a breeze to work with, and others create more obstacles.
I guess I'm trying to get a flavor for what it might have been like from your point of view to be at Marvel at that time. The 80s was an interesting time because you had all these, big artist personalities at Marvel. Simonson, Miller used to be there, Claremont, like all of these kind of very famous creative types. And at the same time, you had the rise of the indie comics because, comics was in that sort of like that flush of expansion. Plus you had Shooter, and there's lots of stories about the dynamics of him running Marvel at the time. So it must have been like quite a lively place to be.
Oh, without a doubt. It was lively, and usually in a good way. I mean, there was conflict here and there, and there was friction between editors and writers and editors and artists at times. And I had my friction here and there with different people, but overall, it was a ball. It was like going to a party and getting paid to be there. It was a great time to be there.
Well, I mean, if you were doing a full-time job during the day and then you were doing writing chores freelance at night, you must have enjoyed it. I mean, I can't imagine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, look, no, I don't think anybody stayed in Marvel, at least in editorial, like working on the comic books as an editor or in a creative capacity as a writer or artist. I don't think anybody stayed there because they just needed a paycheck. They stayed there because they loved doing the work, So it wasn't like working as a bank teller. I don't mean to slam any bank tellers.
Sure.
It's not like, people were there because they wanted to be there, and they fought hard to get there. Well, like as you kind of alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, it's not, people back then maybe could just wander in and get a tour and maybe get a job someday, but it's pretty tough getting a job in the comic book industry. It always has been.
Yeah, and I guess one that you can kind of pay the bills with, as opposed to, having to work another.
Right. Well, it helped being an editor, but an editor gave you a steady paycheck. Sure. Yeah.
You kept like so much of your stuff. Is that and so many people didn't. Like I saw that talk you did about the Transformers, and just the notes that you still had, the chart of powers and all of these different sketches and things that you had for your slide presentation just blew me away. Was it like, are you habitually like that? Do you save everything, or?
Yeah, I'm just a pack rat.
Okay, you're a pack rat.
There was no plan to it. Now I look back and I think, it's a good thing I saved all that stuff. People will pay me big money for it someday.
Yeah.
People would pay me big money for it tomorrow if I agreed to do anything with it, but I don't feel the need.
You could also make a book out of it or something.
Yeah, definitely. There's different options out there, and it's a good thing I have it. In fact, a number of years ago, there was a Transformers. He's a writer, encyclopedist type of guy. He was at my house for a couple of days just scanning all this stuff for one of his books.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I was trying to kind of get a sense when we originally connected about kind of what you're doing these days. Like that dream of being a comic book illustrator or artist or just working in comics, has that kind of expired? Have you pretty much satiated that?
Well, okay, so time moves on. I changed. The conditions in the industry changed. I was expelled from Marvel back in the 96, and I thought it was a good time to move on and move out of comics because comics were imploding at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I moved on. I figured, well, I gave it my best shot. I had a good run. I enjoyed most of my time there, and now it's time to move on and try something else, which is what I did.
Do you want to talk about what it is that you're doing? Is writing part of that, or?
Okay, well, I mean, basically, I moved from Marvel over to Scholastic. Scholastic is a children's book publisher, so I was an assistant creative director there for about 6 years, and then I went freelance for them. And while I was freelancing out of my house, I wound up getting involved with my local recreation commission and where I live here in New Jersey, and now I'm the director of recreation.
Cool. Do you ever kind of like see the huge, bucks that movies are making these days, and the massive comic conventions and all of that, and say, I want in, I want to be.
I like being involved, but I'm also realistic. There's a whole new, there's not just a generation, but there's several generations of new creative people that have filled the void, and it's hard to go back. So, I could sit here and pine all day about, I wish I was in comics again, or I could be realistic and say, I had my run, and like every industry, things move ahead, and they probably need younger, more relevant people than me. Meanwhile, I'm still doing commissions, and I'm. Excuse me, it's very different. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really the same job, in my opinion, but.
I think you're right. I think the industry's changed in a lot of different ways. But in any case, in my situation, I get invited to conventions, so I go occasionally to different conventions, and I'm there to meet the public and my fans from way back, and I do sketches and all that stuff, and then I do commissions on the side, and so I'm still involved in that sense.
Cool.
But I don't spend my days and weeks trying to get a job at one of the major publishers. It's just not in the cards. It's not my interest right now.
Sure. So usually at this point, I kind of ask if you want to pitch anything or if you want to kind of speak for anything before we wrap up.
Well, thank you for offering me the platform. I'm not really pitching anything, but I'm not really doing anything. All I would say is, if anybody is interested in having me do commissions, find me on Facebook.
Cool.
That's how many people have found me over the years, and I'll add you to the list. I'll get in touch, we'll talk, and I'll see what I can do for you. But beyond that, it's not like I have any projects in the works that I'm about to publish one way or another. It's just what I'm just sitting on the laurel. I'm resting on my laurels of things I've done in past years. Put it that way.
Oh, that's a nice place to be.
Yeah.
Bob Budiansky is on Twitter @BobBudiansky. Let us know what you think. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Tweet us @DeconComics. Like our Facebook page or join our active Facebook group. We also invite you to join us on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU, where this weekend we'll publish our review of Black Panther, with special guest my brother Paul. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Can you think of one person you know who would enjoy what we're doing on Deconstructing Comics and Critiquing Comics? Send that person a text message right now and let them know about our show. Thanks. You can also help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Do your shopping at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon so that we get a percentage of the sale. And share our episodes on your social media. We appreciate your support in bringing Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles to a larger audience. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Critiquing Comics will return next week, discussing 2 more issues of David Dye's Amazing Tales. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.
Podcast.